Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm very happy that Pierre Hazan could make it from Geneva to join us for the presentation of his new book. My name is Gilad Ben-Nun. People know me here. I'm part of Gezi. Steffi, Marung, director of Gezi. We've been cooperating for many years. Pierre was here, I think, 10 years ago. But I'll briefly introduce Pierre. Journalist, doctorate from Geneva and Harvard Law School, senior fellow at the United States Institute for Peace, then director of policy for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and for many years now a strategic advisor for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which for people who know mediation is pretty much the most important private diplomacy organization in the world. Pierre was also a member of the Commission on Peace in the Basque, which resolved the Basque conflict in Spain, and has written many books on the topics of transitional justice, wars in Yugoslavia, and now more broadly about negotiation. In terms of what we're going to try and do today is we will begin with a presentation by Pierre of the book, coming from his own experiences, both before he became part of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and especially when he began to reflect on the book as presidential fellow at the Robert Bosch Stiftung here in Germany, in Berlin. Then we will go over to a comment by Dr. Steffi Marung. I have a few questions afterwards, and then we will open the floor for your questions. So thanks for coming. Pierre.
Okay, thank you, Gilad. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation we are going to have. What Gilad has said is exactly that. I'm more a practitioner than an academic, and nevertheless, I try to reflect a bit about my experiences and to broaden it a bit. So I work in mediation, and I was struck by the fact that we don't reflect much about our own trade. And so it started by a very personal experience in which, as a result of a mediation which was very confidential, I was part of a group of humanitarian actors who had to select people who might be free from a terrible detention camp in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and some who will stay in the camp and might die as a result. And that was a very moral, troubling experience. And that makes me think about choices, moral choices in extreme situations. And then I joined this organization of mediation in armed conflict. And sometimes also I've seen very, very difficult dilemmas. And I start to think about trade-offs. Basically, when you think about Gaza, when you think about Sudan, when you think about Ukraine, there are trade-offs. People are looking for compromise. You heard about the grain deal between Ukraine and Gaza.
Russia.
In American and Russia, thank you. In Gaza, there is still a mediation process, not very successful, but there was not long ago a limited agreement to free some hostages against a ceasefire. So there are still mediation happening. But what are the limits of these trade-offs? And when we say trade-offs, we mean that there will be winners, but there might be losers. And how is the peace economy working? What is the price for peace? Or what is the price for an agreement? And I tried to think about it, didn't find much, because very often most of the deals or most of the peace agreements are pretty confidential. but as I was working in this organization, I asked a lot of people around me and my own experiences. And that's why I started this process about the price for peace. Who is paying it? And I discovered that sometimes it's the majority of the people. It's women who are paying the price for peace. Sometimes it's minorities. Sometimes it's third parties. But also I realized that in order to approach this subject, I need to have some understanding of the mediation field, how since the end of the Cold War it has evolved. Who has the right to sit at the table? Who is invited to sit at the table? And I realized that the answer has changed throughout time. Even in the last 30 years or so, the answer has changed dramatically. So there is for me a first period, which is the 90s. You know, the 90s is this unilateral movement, the American, the sole superpower. And the UN is playing such an important role. There is the bestseller of the time is The End of History. And sounds so far away from today. And there is the liberal peace paradigm, which is so important that through markets and elections, basically, and democracy, the world will be much better. And then, at the same time, during this period, new rules were elaborated and regarding justice. And some of you may remember that during the war in former Yugoslavia, there was the establishment for the first time ever of an international criminal tribunal during wartime, which is something very unheard of. In 1993, and the following year, in 1994, it was Rwanda. 1998 is the Rome Statutes, and which basically say that you cannot discuss anymore with war criminals. Criminals need to be behind doors. They cannot be invited for negotiation, for discussion, for mediation. And the UN, obviously, if it wants to achieve its goal, cannot discuss with these people. And that created immediately a huge tension. Because on the one hand, you want to discuss with the ones who are considered the very bad guys. And on the other hand, you are saying, well, we cannot discuss with them. So we had, in the middle of the 90s, this tension of peace versus justice. And we know what happened in the 90s. We had, a lot of, so the rules started to change. It was impossible to have so-called war criminals at the table, but also amnesty laws were being redefined, much more than no more blanket amnesties. Immunity was also totally redefined. So justice was taking a huge place. And at the same time, mediators had the difficulty they wanted to discuss. So how do you do that? And obviously, there was Bosnia-Herzegovina. And at one point, it was decided, the prosecutors indicted Karadzic and Mladic, the leaders of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but not Milosevic, because they wanted Milosevic at the table of negotiations. So you see this tension. And these tensions continue to build up, obviously, during that period. But then a second period started with 9/11. After the 9/11, there is the resolution 1373 of the Security Council, which basically stated it's forbidden to speak with so-called terrorist organizations. And the UN started to make lists of terrorist organizations. And the US had already a list. The EU started the list. Britain started the list. And a lot of autocratic countries were very, very happy because they could enjoy and say, well, there are proscribed groups, there are terrorist organizations, we don't want to talk with them anymore. Sometimes it was legitimate organizations, but from their perspective, they could say, well, there are terrorist organizations. And that created a new problem, because suddenly, because in the beginning, after 2001, there was the feeling of the ambition of the Americans and possibly the Russians to eliminate so-called terrorist organizations, but it didn't work. So what do? The system was blocked, was not working. And the solution of this contradiction basically came through private organizations of mediation, which started to fill a gap in international system. And I'm working for one of these organizations, which were created at the time. The Center for Humanitarian Dialogue was created in 2000, basically. The CMI, which is another organization, the same. So suddenly there was a gap in international relations, needed to talk with the people it was forbidden to talk to. But in the same time, states could say, well, we are not talking to them, but they are paying private organizations to do the work they don't want to do. So that is the system which, to a certain extent, is still operating today. So to go back, in the 90s, we have the first layer, which is still operating. The whole, basically, the peace versus justice dilemma. Then you add a second layer, which is the war on terror and all the problems it has created in terms of effective mediation. And then we had possibly a third period, which started for me around Libya and Syria, around 2011 and 2012, when the world started to be less unipolar and more multipolar. And you have a lot of different players starting to play into the game. Regional powers like Turkey, like Brazil, like South Africa, like China, obviously. And that changes radically the political landscape. And the game became much more sophisticated with different alliances and sometimes very, how can I say, brief alliances according to the needs of the moment, which could be shifting. And then now there is a new phenomenon in this multipolar world, is the return to interstate conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, the full-fledged, not like 2014, or Iran and Israel. So there is a new landscape. So that's basically for me, the landscape where I started to think about difficult issue, how mediators are working in these difficult issues. And what I saw in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also from a very different perspective, happened in Syria. And we can also make the case for Gaza, is at what time do we decide that it's best to help a process of ethnic cleansing? In Bosnia and Herzegovina, what I've seen is UN, UNHCR, ICRC, in particular, had a real dilemma. What do you do? I mean, basically, a lot of people were threatened to be killed if they don't accept to be ethnically cleansed. And in order to soften this process, the UN at one point and the ICRC decided to help. But by helping that, you become almost accomplice of a process of forced deportation of people, which is a war crime. So are you becoming an accomplice of a war crime in order to save the life of people? Maybe you are doing so for very good reasons, but you see that type of tension. In Syria, the context was different. Cities were besieged, and bombed, and starved. And what do you do when there was some kind of almost agreement and you help the population to move from one city which has been besieged to another city, which at one point will be also besieged? Are you still moving the people to a third city and so on and on? And sometimes it's what happens. So mediation organizations had to deal with this issue and to decide to which extent they wanted to alleviate the suffering of a population, but in doing so, it has consequences. And you can also ask, even if it's not very popular and even provocative, to ask this question about Gaza. You can ask the people, you can ask why the Egyptians are not opening the border in order to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinians. Of course, it will facilitate the work of Netanyahu. I agree. But what is best from a humanitarian perspective? So you see how difficult it is. I'm not coming with a mathematical formula. I just want to put on the table the difficulties. And then, and I mentioned it earlier, the peace versus justice. There is, Bosnia and Herzegovina, 120,000 people who were killed during these terrible years. And then we have a peace deal. Great. But let's look more for a second to this peace deal. Basically, the peace deal is based on dividing the power between the three nationalist political parties. So basically, you are giving the power to these nationalists. And at the same time, the more democratic elements are being marginalized. And contrary to the European Court of Human Rights, Rome people and Jews couldn't become president, obviously, because it has to be a nationalist party belonging to one of the three main groups. So you see the limitations. Again, maybe for very good reasons, but it has consequences. And maybe it's not a real peace. It has been a frozen war, and it still is a frozen war. But maybe it's better to have a frozen war than a real peace. Again, we can discuss that, but for the time being, I just want to open the discussion. Third situation, peace versus human rights. Peace versus women's rights. Afghanistan. You know, the Americans say we are there to protect women. But at one point, they wanted to make a deal and to withdraw. In order to withdraw, they have to weaken the Afghan government and they have to weaken the women associations in order to re-legitimize the Taliban, in order to make a deal with them. So that was the price for peace. And again, I've been working in the Sahel region. There have been a number of peace agreements, local peace agreements, not big agreements. But here again, women's rights became, as a result, very, very limited. What were the other choices we can discuss? But again, so sometimes you can find yourself in a very difficult situation also. When we are not sure that one party is seriously engaged in a peace process. It could be a trick. It could be a PR exercise. And possibly sometimes, like it happened in Sri Lanka, the army was pretending to negotiate. In fact, it was preparing a massive military attack which destroyed the Tigers and killed 30,000 people. So again, at one point, the mediators should say enough is enough. I shouldn't continue to give legitimacy to a process which is not a real process. And then there is what we can call the devil's dividend. When one party can ask the mediator to put someone else on the discussions. We can think about Navalny, who suddenly become part of an exchange process between different people. And Putin didn't like the idea. And Navalny was taken basically out of the equation. And so that makes you think a lot. And sometimes peace could be also hurting a third party. We can think about the Abraham Accord. From the Israeli perspective, it was obviously trying to hurt the Palestinian side and also weaken Iran in an alliance with Saudi Arabia against Iran. You see that all of these questions drew my attention, and I think that it was, for me, necessary to try to reflect. So I don't know if I need to continue. I could, or I don't want to depress you also. I mean, let's be very clear about that. I have some very good news also, but I keep them for the end in order for you to be happy when you leave.
Thank you for that, Pierre. Dr. Steffi Marung, comments.
That's a very good transition to what I was about to say. So I had the pleasure to read the book, and what I will try to do is to, on the one hand, reflect a little bit on how I read it and what I took out from it. Maybe that corresponds to what you wanted to say, maybe not. We can discuss this. And then I have 3 directions that we could go in for the discussion, maybe. But indeed, the book starts very gloomy. So if you are not in a good mood, you shouldn't start reading. Although it's very pleasant read, because you quickly then develop a complexity that is also inspiring. But the gloomy situation you just described, and I will put this maybe a little bit more in a sharper way, maybe a little bit polemicizing, describing a multipolar world that is a world after the Pax Americana, so the American hegemony, has collapsed. There are more and more state and non-state actors who do not obey any longer the laws of war. We have an impotent UN. And the relative stability of the Cold War is gone. What has been replaced, or it has been replaced by a new pragmatism that replaces a system of norms that we thought is a stable one. We have a new arms race, and we have a new geopolitical competition, and all this in the context of new global challenges such as the climate crisis that also redefines the rules of conflict and the rules of mediation. So it's a multi-crisis. It's a complete mess. And the book sets out to, in the first part, then to indeed draft a larger historical narrative about the last 3 decades, exactly around the caesuras that Pierre already sketched, and to see how we ended up at this very moment. And these 3 major periods or 3 major caesuras, and maybe kind of sharpen this a little bit more. You put it in very polite ways, but let me put this a little bit more, it's late in the evening way. So the 1990s, the Cold War has ended, the Soviet Union has collapsed, the end of history is there. This gives rise to a new morality in international politics and an enthusiasm about the peace dividend. So a world that is now stable again, guaranteed by the hegemon of the USA. And these decades, already in the 1980s, saw humanitarian intervention as a new tool in international relations. Some of you might remember Mary Calder's book on that as well. So this seems to be now a new way of how to deal with international conflicts. And this rise of humanitarian intervention is complemented also by a golden age of mediation. And Pierre writes that mediation became the major ideological marker of the values vaunted by the new international order. Liberalism was the ultimate goal for societies. So it is in the context of a liberal world order after the end of the Cold War that gives rise to this peculiar way of mediation. And that this period sees the introduction of a new figure of the devil. So the devil changes the face in this narrative here, but it steps up here first as the war criminal as the enemy. This is a legal and discursive framing of certain actors in those conflicts that is introduced, and that is an instrument of moving certain actors out of the equation, away from the negotiation table. But it's not only the introduction of this war criminal figure in these negotiations, but it's also what Pierre describes a increasing politicization of international criminal justice, and also the reference to human rights that then poses a new challenge to mediation, because it's not only that humanitarian intervention or the criminalization of certain war practices is introduced, but it's also tied to certain political projects, and this gives rise to what Pierre describes as a judicial diplomacy, and in another part or part of the section of the book, you refer to it as judicial neo-imperialism. So it is becoming also politically contested. That period of the 1990s, this golden age of mediation, then becomes or turns into cold turkey for mediators, one could say, after 9/11 and after the onset of the war on terror. So these events from New York to Madrid, London, Paris, Berlin, Nice, you name it, has dramatically reframed the way how state actors and major important international actors look at mediation and at the laws of war, and they were reframing actors in conflicts as terrorists, again as an instrument of moving some actors away from the negotiation table, but in more radical terms actually than simply as criminalizing them, but really muting their voices. This also has introduced new norms in warfare and procedures to end wars. I would add it also has added the extraterritorialization of the enemy's persecution with Guantanamo, for example. So it is complemented by the establishment of extra-normative spaces in which, for example, torture would be tolerated while it would not be tolerated within democracies. And in this context, the room for mediation almost collapsed. You refer to those shifting and variable lists of whom you are allowed to talk to and who not. But it's not only that these lists of terrorist organization is volatile, but connected to it is also the role of mediators, who then become, so to say, second-rank terrorist organizations, so to say, if they are talking to terrorists. And it would be interesting to look into who is defining these lists and who is able to implement them. But this has dramatically complicated the work of mediators in this multipolar world. At the end of the 2000s, this then gives room to an increasingly multipolar world in which new actors, also state actors, emerge as players in the geopolitical game, including China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. But they do not only emerge as regional or global powers, but they also emerge as potential mediators. So they complicate much more the landscape of what are the norms actually to which we need to adhere. So it is, in this regard, a multipolar world, not only in the sense that there are new state actors emerging, but it's also multipolar in the sense that there are new types of actors beyond the territorialized nation states. Governments emerge. One could say this is an effect of the respatialization of the world. It's also respatializing war and peace in that regard, in the sense of what kind of actors are allowed to sit at the negotiation table. And this complication, Pierre has described, it gives room to a new kind of entrepreneurs, of a new kind of business, I would say polemically, namely a private mediation agency. So it gives rise to a private diplomacy, as Pierre frames it, which is very interesting, I think, to look at, as Pierre explained. It seems to close a gap or a fracture, or jumps into a fracture in the international system. The 2000s then lead into the 2010s in a period that radicalizes this multipolarity and radicalizes the demise of Western hegemony, that again redefines the space for mediation and also redefines the types of mediators and their resources and competences. It is characterized by also a deregulation of warfare, increasingly complemented or as an effect of the crisis of the UN. And Pierre leads us through the 2000s into the present moment, from Iraq to Kosovo, Libya, Syria, you name it, where we then also end in Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza. The NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 also appears a very crucial moment as a caesura in the transition from this 2000s war on terror order into this multipolar deregulated order, as it has delegitimized certain normative claims on the R2P principle, which in the eyes of some participants of these negotiations, Russia in particular, has collapsed the Western liberal normative order in many respects. So this gloomy narrative in the first part is then complemented in the second part by this zooming into specific gray zones, gray areas as Pierre calls them, to more closely look into exactly the complexities and ambiguities of what mediators find themselves in. And the cases are the International Committee of the Red Cross at the end of the Second World War and how it dealt with the persecution and the annihilation of Jews, struggling to define or redefine neutrality in the face of genocide. The second case, or a bunch of cases he looks at, is Kosovo and Srebrenica, and how the UN redefined neutrality in the face of genocide. And then finally with Syria and the Sahel region, looking into the moral dilemmas that result from this tension between the goal to protect civilians and the restrictions to negotiate with actors that are excluded from the equation because they are labeled as terrorists. So this part is extremely inspiring as it, on the one hand, discusses this, the complexity of neutrality and impartiality, which Pierre differentiates, and carefully situates these concepts in their historical context. So what the book really is very strong in is that it goes beyond a neutralizing language of the lawyer, but rather situates these terms very carefully in their historical concepts. It also looks into the ambiguities of the mediator's role, not having this mathematical formula at hand, but having to carefully revisit permanently their positions to observe when and how they are instrumentalized by conflicting parties and to make a decision when it's okay to be instrumentalized and when not. So very carefully drawing attention to timing and context in that regard, but also drawing attention to the limitations of mediators. So it also invites here a lot for humility, what I would say, being cautious about generalizations and accepting the fragmentation of the present. So in that regard, I think that the book provides, I would say, four main arguments to discuss. Firstly, that is that these transitions from the end of the Cold War into today are crucial, and both the very much celebrated introduction of international criminal justice in the 1990s and the war on terror have been counterproductive and have in many ways contributed to the present problem. Secondly, the exclusion of certain actors from the negotiation table, either by framing them as war enemies or criminals or as terrorists, has radicalized and escalated many conflicts and reduced the scope for negotiation. Thirdly, in this multipolar world with new global challenges that Pierre characterizes, it is ever more important to pay attention, and everybody who does global and European studies will rejoice on that. It is important to pay attention to the interaction, intermingling between local and regional contexts and global contexts. So you cannot be an expert only on one place or country and that's it, but rather you have to be very much open and ready to consider other connections. And finally, we need in this novel world the search for a new moral compass that is not easily replaced by another set of norms, but rather by a new way of deliberating with each other. Maybe questions or comments or points for discussion I would throw on the table here is, while you might have noticed that I was very much inspired and a fan of reading the book, and I learned a lot. The first comment comes as an historian of the Cold War, to think about how the transition that you describe of the last 3 decades has a prehistory in the Cold War decades, and in which way maybe these 1 or 2 decades of the 80s and 90s maybe are very, very specific and rather the exception from the rule than a new normality. So when I look into the 60s and 70s and the wars around decolonization and how liberation movements try to find their place at the negotiation table, we also saw a multiplication of the types of actors that were involved in these negotiations. International organizations were quite crucial to give them the room to become these kind of actors, such as UNESCO, but also the ICRC was very important. So I was wondering in how far this multiplicity of the types of actors is actually something which is quite normal in broader global history processes, and while the 1990s are rather than here an exception to the rule. Also with historical, in a historical perspective, I was wondering if, again, this Western hegemony that you described for the 1990s also is very exceptional, particularly when you look at the 20th century, because for the 20th century, after the Russian Revolution, there was this big competitor in town, which indeed also resulted in the contestation of liberal norms of the international game. And I'm just wondering how you would reflect on this mode of competition, in which way you would see this different to today's mode of competition. A second thought I had leads me into the direction of thinking about the role of the mediator. I was really fascinated in how you reflect on your own experiences, how you became a mediator from being a journalist, and how you reflected on the different roles people have at the negotiation table, from observer to mediator to humanitarian worker to combatant, etc., and how important that is that we understand those different roles. But I also was wondering what it takes to become a good mediator. What kind of professionalization you see as crucial? You hint at these moments in your book at certain times, and also on the institutional context it takes. And I was just wondering, also with an eye on a global and European studies crowd here, what does it take to become a good mediator? And finally, and that gives you the moment to give us a bit hope, what are the perspectives for the future? So you start with this gloomy picture, but I would argue you actually end on a quite positive note, because in the last chapter you very nicely describe how important the negotiation of local agreements is, going beyond universalizing big normative schemes. And how much potential there is, particularly when you look at the Sahel. But also you look, into a number of challenges mediators are now faced with beyond the multipolar world, but also the question of alternative facts, questioning truths, that indeed is a bigger problem also for mediators. But there is, this hint towards this private diplomacy, which seems to be a way, or could be maybe also understood as a way to re-stabilize the situation. So asking for this hope, I would close my comments.
Thank you so much, Steffi.
Pierre.
Okay. Well, really, thank you so much for your very attentive reading. And very often, a few times I've been often to explain myself about my attitude toward international justice. And because you say the word, and I would like to come back to it. Well, I think the concept of international criminal justice is beautiful. I'm very skeptical to have international criminal justice in a time of war. Okay, here I will. I mean, what is really interesting, if you go back to history, and I think it's interesting to go back to history, the resolution 808 and 827, which established the ICTY, the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, was the product of the French, and in particular by Roland Dumas. And I met this Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I say, well, you are the man who started a revolution of international relations. It's not only a legal revolution that you created, but really a revolution in international relations. You go with the resolution 808, it's adopted, first ever tribunal to indict war criminals in wartime, then Rwanda, then ICC, becoming really global justice and all of that. And he looked at me and I say, well, it's not exactly that. I had a problem. And my problem is Mitterrand was the president and myself were perceived as being pro-Serbian. And I was afraid one day to be accused, like in a future Nuremberg trial, to be on the dock. And I say, no, I needed a shield. And when the Justice Minister, Robert Badinter, came to see me with his candid idea, and it's a complex story because, but first of all, during that time, I thought that I didn't listen carefully, so I repeated twice for my 2 ears. And I say, wow, that's why France didn't collaborate with the ICTY at the time. Yes, exactly. I said, if it has a preventive effect, that's great. But it's very useful politically for us. And what is amazing with the ICTY, it's the only tribunal, I think, possibly in the existence, which was not supposed to work, but actually everyone was arrested, who was indicted, was arrested, or died before. So it's a tribunal which was not supposed to work, created for cynical reasons, got a 100% success because the political equation has changed. I found it fascinating because, but in the same time, it depends so much on the political equation. And that's the problem. And when it takes just a few days to indict Gaddafi in Libya by the prosecutor of the ICC, and when it takes years and years, since 2015, the ICC has opened an investigation on Israel and Palestine. No one has been indicted. The first decision of Karim Khan, the current prosecutor, has been to deprioritize the investigation against the Americans in Afghanistan. When you see all that, you say, hey, listen. Oh, where are we going? Not speaking about Russia and Georgia and so many other places and Africa and all of that. So I think I'm very careful. I think it's very important, and when I talk to victims, they need justice. But I'm afraid sometimes the expectations are very high, and then it's politically manipulated, and I think it's extremely damaging. Now, on I totally agree with what you say, and you write. Obviously, mediators. I mean, you can find mediators even in the Bible, I guess, but also in Greek plays also. So it goes throughout history. And you're right. The 60s, the 70s. There is no discussion about it. Yes. And just a word, you mentioned the RCRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Actually, my organization is called officially the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Henri Dunant Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. So basically, VRCRC was not able to have political negotiations or to have political mediation. It just wanted to remain in the domain of humanitarian action. And that's why I didn't really involve, and that's why my organization has been created as a result. But you're right, I mean, there have been a number of different actors throughout time, including the Pope, which throughout centuries was the main actor in terms of mediation inside Catholicism. Now, on the different roles, I think what is really interesting is mediation as a trade started almost as a club of British gentlemen in the modern times. But it has evolved. I mean, there have been always, in all traditional societies, mediators. And today, I think we are part of the landscape, and we are playing a very important role. When my organizations or other organizations are working in Mali or in any country, basically, they will rely to local mediators, and they will hire local mediators. So I think these people, usually they are taking a lot of risks. They could be perceived as spies or traitors by their own community or by the other side.
They get killed.
They can get killed, and it happens a few times or many times. So that's something which is, regarding the profiles, I guess, I think we need to understand that mediations, it's usually a team of mediation with different roles. Someone will be specialized in dealing with disarmament or trying to bring together a militia and the national army. How do you mix both? What kind of grades, what kind of ranks? How a general in the militia or in an armed group will be a colonel in the army or general? How does it work? So you get people specialized on that. You get people specialized on dialogue, political dialogue. And you get people like me who get specialized in justice issues. What kind of, the first thing people want to know is, will I be indicted, basically? If there is a peace process, and if the peace process is successful, who is going to jail? Will there be a tribunal? Will the ICC be involved? Will the international community create a hybrid tribunal or national tribunal? How the amnesty law will work? Who will be the targets? So that's also, so there are all these different, profiles. And then regarding the perspectives, what is interesting is now we realize that, for a long time we realized actually that 50% of the peace agreements are failing within 5 or 10 years' time. And why? Because basically it's an elite deal between the president and an armed group very often. And very often most of the population is not part of a discussion. And they get very much frustrated. And if the frustration is too strong, then the whole peace process collapsed. And it's what's happening in so many times. That's why I think it's very important today to have broader understanding of a society and to be more inclusive in peace processes. And so there is a difficult trade-off because you don't want the table to be enormous because it's too difficult. But so you want to have something manageable, but at the same time you want to be inclusive. So you need to find ways, and there are ways to be inclusive enough, but not in the driving seat. I think what's happening also today is it's really interesting, not only having more local mediators and more women on board, because I haven't spoken about women, but women are obviously very important in any society. So there are key actors also, who also need to be included in these peace processes. And then we have new challenges, climate. When you look at, basically, if you take all the Sahel regions, coming basically from Senegal, you cross all the continent with Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and so on, Sudan, Chad, Sudan, to Ethiopia and Eritrea, you have countries which are all at war, all of them, basically, maybe except Senegal. And you have these basic conflicts between sometimes jihadists and the governments or armed groups, but you have also basically micro conflicts linked to climate. I mean, because of limited resources, communities are fighting for very, very limited resources. And if you want, I can develop more. Then there is artificial intelligence, then social networks, which created a new problem. And you are trying, in my organization, there are some people who are working, trying to adapt mediation to artificial intelligence, to hybrid warfare, and all of that. But how do you define? How do you define what an electronic ceasefire is? It's very difficult on social networks. So there are a lot of discussions about that. Then we have cartels, criminal cartels, which sometimes are as strong as states. What do? You think, I don't want to discuss with them because if I discuss with them, I legitimize them, and then the rule of law, or what remains of the rule of law, will be even weaker? Or do you engage with them? So I think that's so there are now a lot of very intense discussion and exploration about how to deal with these different issues.
I have a question. The book came out now in 2024, but the French version came out 2 years beforehand. An English chapter appeared in the Palgrave Handbook on Diplomatic Thought and Practice, which we edited here in Leipzig. And you took the time to the English edition to add a preface about Gaza, because it came out already after. The preface does not exist in the French edition, of course. And one of the things that in this preface you mentioned is this never-endingness of negotiation, right? At the end of the Second World War, we came to some sort of end of a conflict. Nixon goes, Kissinger, they do the Vietnam, the Treaty of Paris. There is an end to something. Now there's a feeling that there's no end to anything. It's a sort of a never-ending, rolling ball of negotiations and ceasefires and sort of agreements or whatever. What is the effect of this never-endingness of this whole thing?
Yeah, well, I think I was struck, the 21st of November, there was the agreement between Israel and Hamas through Qatar
yes.
and the US and Egypt. By the way, I mean, it will be too long to develop, but Qatar was hosting, as you know, Hamas, the political headquarters of Hamas. But it was hosting also the main military base and the central command of the Americans for Asia in Qatar. So, and it's the Americans who asked at the time Hamas, who used to be based in Syria, to go to Qatar because the Americans were afraid that Hamas will go to Iran and it will be much more difficult to know what's happening. So just to have more complexity about the role of each one. But so there is this agreement which is very specific and drew my attention. I have only one day to write about it, but it was still fascinating to me because part of the deal was not only to liberate a number of Palestinian prisoners, but also that the length of a ceasefire could be extended in exchange of 10 more hostages per day who will be liberated as a result. And so there was a kind of accountability, not, can you say?
Calculation,
the price per the hostage was basically 2 hours, 40 minutes.
Of a ceasefire.
Of ceasefire, more ceasefire. And say, wow, it's, even thinking about it, what does it say about what we are today? And then, for me, I realized, and to come back to your point, we moved to the liberal peace paradigm to something which is very different, which is basically the transactional deals. We are making deals in the middle of a war. And when we think about it, it's not only exchange of prisoners, which happened since old times, but it's other things. When you think about the agreements between Israel and Lebanon, Lebanon doesn't recognize the state of Israel. But in the same time, both of them decided they wanted to exploit the gas in the Med Sea. So they agreed on the maritime border, although
they don't agree.
Lebanon is at war with a state which it doesn't recognize. But you see how strange it is. The grain deal also was in the same time you want to kill the other side, but you are making a deal. And you're making a deal because it has an effect in Africa. And the day Putin decided to change his mind and accept the deal was the day he met, and everyone was waiting for that among the mediation team. He was meeting the president of the African Union. And a lot of countries which were buying Ukrainian wheat were actually close to Russia. So that's why Putin decided to go for this deal first, and then 2 times when he decided that it was no more worth for it. Then we have seen also COVID ceasefires, which is very new. There was never any public health ceasefires, as we know of. So we see some evolution. But basically, to come back to your main point, now we have just kind of deals which will last as long as every side finds a short-term interest. And that says a lot about the volatility and the multipolarity of this world.
You promised to close on a happy note.
Yeah, yes. You mentioned a gin tonic. No, I think what is really interesting today in terms of mediation, it's not the geopolitics. We know the geopolitics, and it's not the mediation which are going to change the tensions between Russia and so many countries and so on and on and on. No, what is really interesting in terms of mediation is how there are new fields which are being explored and how it's getting more inclusive, and you are trying to better understand how societies could be more on board and not to have any more kind of elite deals. And I think for me that's a very interesting development. And to have, basically, I work a lot in the Sahel region. If you go to Niger, in which I work a lot, the average age is 15 years old. In Germany, in Switzerland, it's 42 years old. So when you have a society, basically, when the average age is 15 years old, and you have leaders who are 50, 60, 70 years old, there is a total disconnect. So when you work in this region, you need to have on board the women and the youth. And so we tried really, really hard to create systems in the local peace agreements we made to have part of the population on board. And I think for me that was a fascinating experience also, something also very new to me, but fascinating experience, yes. Did I did the job?
It's okay. Women and youth, right?
I thank very much for the wonderful comment by Steffi. I thank Pierre for flying in from Geneva and coming to be with us. I thank you for being here and for your questions. And we're always open afterwards for emails and carry on for the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.